The Zodiac killer terrified Northern California. He shot and stabbed people. He sent letters to newspapers. He taunted the police. His communications were a mix of ego, threats, and bizarre ciphers. He claimed credit for murders, some confirmed, some not. His reign of terror was concentrated in a short, violent period from 1968 to 1969. After that, the murders stopped. The letters, however, continued for a few more years. The last letter, widely accepted by all experts as authentic, came in January 1974. It was a strange rambling note about the movie The Exorcist. It called it the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen. Then, silence. For years, nothing. The case grew cold. The files gathered dust. The terror faded into a chilling local legend. People began to think he was dead, or in prison for something else. The story, it seemed, was over. But it wasn't. 4 years later, in 1978, a new letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. The handwriting was eerily familiar. The tone was boastful. It was signed with the Zodiac's cross-circle symbol. It declared, "I am back with you." And with that, a new and confusing chapter of the Zodiac mystery began. The big question was, and still is, was it really him? Or was this the work of a copycat, a hoaxer playing a sick game with the city's old wounds? To understand the post-1974 letters, you have to understand the original Zodiac. He wasn't just a killer. He was a media creation of his own making. He needed the attention. He craved the fear he generated. His letters were his oxygen. In them, he gave himself his name, he designed his own symbol, and he built his own myth. He threatened to shoot children on a school bus. He claimed he was collecting slaves for the afterlife. He sent complex codes that he claimed held his identity. He was a performer, and the Bay Area was his stage. So when he suddenly stopped, it felt wrong. It was out of character. For a man so desperate for the spotlight, why just walk away? This is what made the 1978 letter so plausible at first. Maybe he couldn't stay away. Maybe the urge to taunt, to be the Zodiac again, was just too strong. The 1978 letter hit the San Francisco Police Department like a ghost from the past. It claimed the old spark was missing, but that he needed to be noticed. It warned that the police would never catch him because he was too clever. On the surface, it sounded just like him. The same arrogance, the same misspellings, the same chilling sign-off. The SFPD, unsure what to do, sent it to the state's top document examiners at the California Department of Justice. This is where the debate really begins. Handwriting analysis is not as black and white as television makes it seem. It's a science, but it's also an art of interpretation. People's handwriting changes over time. It changes with age, with illness, with mood, with the pen and paper they use. The original Zodiac letters were written almost a decade earlier, so the experts had a tough job. 3 separate analysts at the CDOJ examined the 1978 letter. They compared it to the canon Zodiac letters from 1969 to 1974. Their conclusion was shocking. They believed it was authentic. They stated the similarities are sufficient to conclude that the writer of the 1978 letter and the writer of the Zodiac letters are one and the same. For a moment, it seemed the monster was back. The news sent a new wave of fear and fascination through the public. But other experts, especially within the SFPD and other involved police departments, were not so sure. They had lived with the Zodiac's words for years. They knew his cadence, his style. To many of them, this new letter felt off. It felt like an imitation. It was a good imitation, maybe the best I'd ever seen, but it lacked something. It was like listening to a cover band. All the right notes were there, but the soul was missing. The original letters had a raw, unhinged energy. This 1978 letter felt more calculated, more self-conscious. It was someone trying to sound like the Zodiac. The biggest argument against the letter being real was what it didn't contain. The original Zodiac loved to prove he was the killer. He did this by providing details about the crime scenes that only the killer could know. He mentioned the brand of ammunition used. He described the victim's positions. He sent a piece of a victim's bloody shirt with one letter. This was his way of saying, "See, it was me." The 1978 letter had none of this. It made a vague threat. It said he was back. But it offered no proof. There was no new murder to connect it to. There was no secret detail from an old crime. It was just words. For a killer obsessed with proving his work, this was a major red flag. Think about the context of 1978. By then, the Zodiac case was famous. Robert Graysmith, a cartoonist at the San Francisco Chronicle, was already deep into his obsessive research that would become his famous book. The original letters have been published in the newspapers. Anyone with enough dedication could get copies. They could study the handwriting, the phrasing, the spelling errors. A talented and patient forger could create a very convincing fake. The Zodiac had created a template for his own imitation. So, the law enforcement community was split. The official document examiners said it was real, but the gut feeling of many investigators on the ground said it was a hoax. And without a new crime, there was no way to be sure. The letter was a dead end. It was a chilling echo, but it didn't lead anywhere. After the 1978 letter, things got even weirder. A handful of other communications trickled in over the years, each one further muddying the waters. Some were quickly dismissed as obvious fakes from cranks and kids, but a few were good enough to cause debate. In the mid-1980s, letters started arriving not from the Zodiac himself, but from someone claiming to be a friend. These were bizarre and taunting, and some were sent to media personalities. Again, the handwriting was studied. Again, the conclusions were mixed. The idea of a friend of the Zodiac was strange. Was this the real killer playing a new game? Or was it just another layer of hoax? Someone trying a new angle on an old story? Most investigators leaned toward hoax. The Zodiac was a narcissist. He was the star of his own show. It seemed unlikely he would ever share the spotlight even with a fictional friend. Then came the 1990 Eureka card. This was a postcard sent to the Chronicle with a photocopy of a key taped to it. It was a Christmas card from the town of Eureka. The message was short and cryptic. This one felt a little more like the old Zodiac. The use of a strange visual element, like the key, was his style. He had sent ciphers and drawings before, but again, the same problems popped up. The handwriting was close, but was it perfect? Some said yes, some said no. And what did the key mean? It was never identified. It led nowhere. It was another puzzle with no solution, which could be exactly what the real Zodiac would do, or exactly what a clever copycat would do to imitate him. The problem with all these later letters is a concept called confirmation bias. People see what they want to see. An examiner who believes the Zodiac was still active might focus on the similarities in the handwriting, or an investigator who thinks the case is long dead might focus on the differences. Both could be looking at the same letter and coming to opposite conclusions. As time went on, the evidence for a copycat grew stronger. The rise of the internet in the 1990s made information about the Zodiac case accessible to everyone. The Zodiac's letters, his ciphers, his entire persona were now just a few clicks away. This created a fertile ground for hoaxers. The barrier to entry for becoming a Zodiac suspect, or a Zodiac letter writer, became incredibly low. The final nail in the coffin for the authenticity of most of these later letters came in 2001. A letter arrived purportedly from the Zodiac that was filled with pop culture references and even mentioned the 9/11 attacks. The handwriting was a decent imitation, but the content was absurd. It felt like a desperate attempt to make the Zodiac relevant in a new century. By this point, most serious investigators had had enough. The FBI's own top document examiners at Quantico had reviewed the post-1974 letters and concluded with much more certainty than the original state analysts that they were likely forgeries. So, what does this all mean? Did a copycat continue the Zodiac's murders? The answer to the murder part is almost certainly no. There are no confirmed Zodiac murders after 1969. The Zodiac's identity was tied to his acts of violence. He killed, and then he wrote about it. The letters were a consequence of the murders, a way for him to claim his work and instill fear. The post-1974 letters were different. They were all talk, they were communications, without the underlying violence that gave the originals their power. They were echoes without a source. This points to the most likely conclusion the post-1974 letters were the work of one or more hoaxers. They were not a continuation of the Zodiac's murder spree, but a continuation of his campaign of psychological terror. And in a way, that's a testament to the Zodiac's twisted success. He created a character so powerful, so iconic, that other people wanted to wear the mask. Why would someone do this? The motivations for a hoaxer are complex. It could be a simple desire for attention, to see their fake letter on the news. It could be a way to insert themselves into a famous, unsolved mystery to feel a connection to something infamous. For some, it might be a power trip, the ability to fool experts and scare the public from the safety of their own home. Well, it takes a certain kind of personality, someone fascinated with the case, patient enough to practice the handwriting, and cruel enough to play with the emotions of victims' families and the public. It's also possible that the 1978 letter was written by a different person than the 1990 postcard. There may not have been a single copycat, but a series of them over the years, each one inspired by the legend. The Zodiac's real silence after 1974 is perhaps the most unsettling part of the mystery. For a man who screamed for attention, the silence is deafening. Did he die? Was he imprisoned? Or did he simply find he no longer needed the attention? Did he just stop? We'll likely never know. But the letters that came after him show the life the myth took on. The Zodiac wasn't just a man anymore. He was an idea. He was a ghost story that people could use to frighten others. The copycat, or copycats, didn't continue his murders. They continued his legend. They kept the ghost alive, they blurred the line between the real killer and the fictional monster he created, making it even harder to find the truth in a case already filled with shadows and lies. The post-1974 letters are a frustrating, confusing, and ultimately sad epilogue to a terrifying story. They represent the long tale of fear and obsession that the Zodiac left behind, a legacy of fake clues and false whispers that continued long after the real killer put down his pen. The very existence of this debate highlights the central problem of the Zodiac case. So much of it is based on his own words. We have his letters, his ciphers, his claims, but we have very little hard physical evidence connecting a single person to all the crimes. The case file is built on a foundation of his boasts. When someone else learns to boast in the same way, it becomes nearly impossible to tell the difference. Let's think about the mindset of an investigator in the late 1970s or 1980s. You have this case that ruined careers and haunted detectives. It's the one that got away. Then a letter comes in. Your first hope is that this is it. A new lead, a mistake he's finally made that will let you catch him. But your second thought is dread. Is this real? Are we about to go through all this again? Or is this some sick individual messing with us, wasting our time, and stirring up old pain for the families of the victims? Every new letter forced them to walk this tightrope of hope and cynicism. The document examiners who authenticated the 1978 letter were not fools. They were professionals. They saw enough similarity in the letter forms, the slant, the spacing, to make a professional judgment. The letter I in the 1978 letter, for example, reportedly had the same distinctive features as the original Zodiacs. Forgers often focus on the more flamboyant letters and make mistakes on the simple ones. A good hoaxer would have to be incredibly meticulous. The possibility remains, however slim, that the 1978 letter was from the real Zodiac, driven out of retirement by his ego. But if it was him, he was a different man. The fire was gone. He was an oldies act playing his greatest hits. I am back with you sounds menacing, but it's also a bit sad, like an old celebrity trying to remind the world he still exists. This contrasts sharply with the raw terror of the early letters. When he sent the piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt to the Chronicle in 1969, it was an act of profound, undeniable menace. It was physical proof, it was gore in an envelope. It was him reaching out from the crime scene and touching the newsroom. None of the later letters had that visceral connection to violence. They were just words on a page, and words can be forged. The culture around the Zodiac case also plays a huge role. It's one of America's great unsolved mysteries, up there with Jack the Ripper. It has inspired books, movies, and a legion of amateur detectives. This ecosystem of obsession is the perfect breeding ground for a copycat. Someone deeply enmeshed in the lore of the case, someone who has spent years studying every detail, might feel they know the Zodiac better than anyone. From there, it's a small leap to wanting to become him, if only on paper. They can solve the mystery by perpetuating it. Consider the psychological toll on the people involved. For the original detectives like Dave Toshti at SFPD, the Zodiac case became a white whale. The later letters were a constant source of frustration. He reportedly believed some of the later communications were real, while others he dismissed. This division shows how even the people closest to the case couldn't find a consensus. The copycats, if that's what they were successful in one thing: they created more confusion. They added more false leads to a case already overflowing with them. They made an impossible job even harder. The ultimate failure of the post-1974 letters to be compelling is their lack of substance. They are a performance of being the Zodiac. The original Zodiac, for all his theatricality, was also a reporter of his own crimes. His letters had a purpose to claim credit and to instill fear based on that credit. The later letters have no credit to claim. They are threats without action, boasts without proof. They are the work of someone who has studied the mask but has never seen the face behind it. They are fan fiction, not a new chapter. In the end, the question of whether a copycat continued the Zodiac's murders has a fairly clear answer. No, the murders stopped. The more complex question is whether a copycat continued his correspondence. All the credible evidence and expert consensus now point to yes. The Zodiac legend became a kind of open-source monster, a template that others could download and use. The real Zodiac killer, whoever he was, likely died or simply faded away sometime after his 1974 Exorcist letter. He left behind a puzzle that may never be solved. The people who wrote the letters after him were not his successors. They were scavengers picking at the edges of his myth. They didn't continue his work, they just plagiarized it. They kept the name in the headlines, but they added nothing to the solution. They were just another one of the Zodiac's victims, in a way people so consumed by his darkness that they tried to wear it as their own. And in doing so, they only helped the real killer disappear deeper into the fog of history. The post-1974 letters are not a part of the Zodiac case. They are a part of the Zodiac's mythology, a mythology that outgrew the man himself and continues to haunt us to this day.